Good morning. Hey, I came from a family of 4 boys. And so every time we came home at the end of the day from school and all, we'd drop all our books and all of our stuff. And every one of us 4 boys would say the same thing just as soon as we busted in the front door. Mom! Because we needed mom for food. We needed mom for healing. We needed mom. My goodness, you think about all the things moms do. All the sleep that goes left unslept, all the diapers, we're not going there, right? All the food, all the sleepless nights, all the worry. I think it's time for all of our moms to stand up and let us give a thunderous applause for our moms. Woo! Yay, moms! Thank you, ladies. These ladies teach us what it means to live for other people. They're kind of forced to do that, right? My goodness. And you think about it, if they weren't here, you wouldn't be either. So just think about that. Hey, we're back in the Jesus story in Luke chapter 12. And we're in a really interesting theme today that has nothing to do with moms, unfortunately, except it starts with M, money, right? But what we're going to talk about is an issue that's very, very American in its nature. We're going to talk about that balance between God and material wealth and how you balance that, how you figure that out. Because all human beings at one level or another struggle with the right attitude about material wealth, whether we realize it or not. And strangely, even though we live in the richest nation on earth, in the wealthiest time of human history, as Americans, we tend to have some of the greatest conflicts about trying to find the right attitude and the right approach toward money and material possessions. And I'll tell you why. It's because there's some underlying assumptions in our culture, and you never hear them stated bluntly because they sound very crass. But I'm going to do it because we're in church this morning, okay? And this is what we see. The underpinnings underneath all of this are a couple of assumptions that more is better because more makes us happy. So we presume more. And what we're going to do is we're going to examine these assumptions in the light of Scripture, in the light of Jesus' teaching, to see if they're really true or not. Now, the way this conversation comes about is Jesus is completely talking on another theme when a strange request rolls in one day as he's teaching. Somebody takes this massive left turn in the midst of heavy traffic. Jesus is talking about profoundly spiritual things, about boldly professing that you belong to him, even if it costs you a lot to do so publicly, big-time identification with this spiritual movement that he's launching in the human race. And all of a sudden, somebody just says, "Oh, teacher," and he just interrupts and completely changes the direction of what Jesus is talking about and asks about money. It's a strange request about money. It shows that this interrupter completely didn't hear what Jesus had said before. And you know how that is, right? You get something in your craw and you don't hear what's going on. It's a little bit like being at a funeral and trying to be reverent, and someone next to you says, "Did you see the donut box out there? It's awesome." You just go, "Come on, man. At least pretend you're sad." And so we get this really strange request, kind of out of nowhere. We find it in Luke chapter 12 at verse 13. And it says, someone in the crowd said to him, and I'll put the words on the screen, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Tell my brother, don't ask him. Tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And then he said, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." So let me give you a principle here. And it's not really one about money at all. It's really about approaching Jesus. And it's that Jesus welcomes interruptions. And by the way, this is really good news because you and I need Jesus all the time. So we should be interrupting him all the time, right? Lord, it's interesting how we pray. God, I just want you to do this. Stop using the word just because you're going to bother him again tomorrow, right? And you don't bother God, but you know what I mean. We will continually need God. So just, Father, please help me with this. And here's a guy that interrupts Jesus. And Jesus, even though he's taken Jesus off of the theme he was developing, Jesus, he not only allows this interruption, he actually seems to welcome it, and he lets it serve as a great launching pad for, yet again, another profound spiritual lesson that people need to hear. So let me give you just a little bit of background. In the scriptures, as well as in Jewish civic law, they did things different than we do in the West, okay? What they did was, it's even in the law of Moses, that when a father dies, he gives the 2 shares of his inheritance to his oldest born son. So if you have 2 sons, that means son number 1 gets 2/3, son number 2 gets 1/3. He gets a single share. Now, you think that's not fair, but essentially they did that so that you could keep the farm intact, and the farm generally went to the oldest son. And well, that's not fair either. Well, the oldest son also was responsible for caring for his mother in her old age, as well as any unmarried sisters. So that just is what it is. That's the way God set it up. So in this case, if you had 2 sons, the second son would get 1/3 of the inheritance, and they'd usually cash him out, and he would go make his fortune or develop his life somewhere else, okay? But the older son generally got the farm. So we have either son number 2 or son number 3 that's coming into Jesus, and we don't even know. Maybe he's already gotten his 3rd share, or maybe he's got, it depends on how many boys there were. But at any rate, maybe he blew through it all, just like the prodigal son, and now he's coming back and he's asking for more. And he wants to get Jesus in the mix because he figures Jesus is a good person to leverage. He's got some power and influence. Jesus, tell my brother to give me more money. Why? Because he wanted more. Why? Because more is better, because more makes you happy. Right? I'm not so sure. So Jesus refuses to get into this family squabble and put himself in between 2 brothers talking about the division of money. But he does allow this interruption to deviate him off of what he was talking about before and begin to talk about the proper attitude and approach of God's people towards money and material wealth. And he does that. And he starts with a pretty strong warning, which was constructed by 2 commands. He first of all says, watch out. And I'll bet it wasn't, hey, watch out. I'll bet it was, watch out! Like a car's about to hit you. You're going to be struck by a meteor. Watch out! Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because greed sneaks in so subtly. And then he grabs you when you least expected it. It does weird things to your heart. Avarice, jealousy, envy, greed, covetousness, materialism, grasping at stuff, feeding the God of more. This is so important. God actually buried this principle in the 10 Commandments. Here's a test. How many commandments are in the 10 Commandments? I was just messing with you. I guess 3rd service, I'm tired, right? It's 10. Commandment number 10 is, thou shalt not covet. Do you remember this one? And then God is more specific. He says you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's workers, your neighbor's ox or donkey, which in today's language would be his car, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Just don't be jealous or envious of anything that belongs to you. It's the classic keeping up with the Joneses. And you wouldn't even think you needed more until you saw that they probably have more, so you should have more, and you just feed on this greed thing, right? And God said, man, we don't use the word covet very much. But to covet something is just to strongly desire to have or possess what someone else has or possesses. You just think you need it because they got it. Homes, marital status, children, jobs, salaries, possessions, accomplishments, recognition, relative health. It's just anything. You're just trying to keep up with the Joneses. It's a classic keep up with the Joneses. Are the Joneses here today? Okay, all right. So we have a problem in our life group because we actually have a family called the Joneses. These are close friends, so we really have to keep up with the Joneses. Okay, sorry. We do have a family, but it's a joke. Okay, never mind. Okay. God says in this passage that we shouldn't be jealous or envious about the status of those around us who seem to have more, particularly in the area of material possessions. And Jesus essentially is saying, okay, maybe you've been climbing up this ladder of materialism for a long time, but you just need to know when you get to the top, you're going to find out it's leaning against the wrong wall. It promises way more than it can deliver. And it results in covetousness. And covetousness is folly. It's a killer. It's a life sucker. It doesn't give you life. It takes life away from you. And by the way, I don't know if you've ever seen, like I said, cartoons and things like that, but there's like this donkey that's pulling this cart, and this guy that's trying to steer the cart, he takes a stick And he holds the stick in front of the donkey's face, and he dangles a carrot about a foot away from the donkey's mouth. And every time the donkey's taking a step forward, guess what? The carrot moves. So the donkey's walking for miles going, then he never gets his carrot. The devil will play the carrot and stick game with you as long as you let him. And you will generally play it if you don't pay attention, because the underlying assumptions are more is better because more makes you happy. It's not so true. Watch out, man. That is real, real subtle. Because the naked truth about our culture is we do hold a superstitious confidence in what money can accomplish. We think that worldly goods and the accumulation of them somehow will give us happiness. We just associate happiness with having more. We don't even test that thought. We just sort of believe it. So Jesus says, watch for even the subtle advances of greed taking root in your heart. Envy, jealousy, all that stuff, because it makes you less than what you are. And Paul says the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. I've seen this happen many, many times. And so Jesus offers us this immortal truth buried in this passage. And I want us all to get this. This is the lesson of the whole thing today, okay? Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Jesus says that in Luke chapter 12, verse 15. Would you read those words with me? Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. What he means is having stuff is not the measure of a good life. It's not the measure of a rich life or a significant life or a successful life. And if you don't believe me, look at the life of Jesus. He refused to gather money or material possessions. In Luke chapter 9, it says, foxes have their dens and birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He was an itinerant, homeless preacher. When Jesus died, they took his clothes. They buried him in a rich man's borrowed tomb. He had nothing. And yet, history has validated and vindicated the life of Jesus as the most successful ever lived, and yet he owned nothing. Do you see what I'm saying? Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. It's so much more than that. And so, what I believe is happening in this passage is if you're going to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus, you need to adopt his value system. And it doesn't mean you can't have a home or a car. What it means is don't get inordinately attached to material things which are here today and gone tomorrow. Or you're just going to be disillusioned with life. Now, most of you would nod your heads with what I've said up to this point. But we also need to admit that we all still struggle on a practical level with this God of more, because it's like a dragon that's always roaring and begging to be fed. This presupposition that more is better, or that somehow more can make you happy. And I got to say, the more you examine those undergirding thoughts, the more you realize that emperor does not have any clothing. Let me just illustrate this a little bit, okay? To enjoy wealth, you must be alive. Am I going too fast? To enjoy wealth, you must be alive. If you're dead, you can't enjoy it, right? Also, to enjoy wealth, you need to have relatively good health. Because if you're dying of cancer or something like that, it doesn't matter how much you have, right? So, does money control whether you stay alive or how healthy you are and if you get cancer or not? No, it does not. Do you see what I'm saying? That emperor has no clothing. It isn't money that delivers the most important things in your life. So Jesus, he wants to underline this by giving what I consider one of the greatest parables in the New Testament. It's a parable about possessions. It's a powerful parable about possessions. And it's called the rich fool. It's in Luke chapter 12. I'm picking it up at verse 16. He told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger barns, bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. And then he does the eagle song. Take it easy. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be for anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. Wow. Those are strong words. And it's not hard to understand the elements of this parable. It's called the rich fool, okay? So you start off with the guy that's got everything. Even before he plants for a harvest, he's got everything. He's got more than enough. He's got surplus. He's got extra. He's a wealthy farmer, okay? Everybody knows him. He's just got it. He's got lots, all right? Then we find out that he has an amazing harvest. On top of the fact that he already had too much in surplus, he's got this amazing bumper crop this year. And I'm not talking about something that will last about a year and a half. We're talking about a bumper crop that probably could take him into decades into the future, okay? Tons of stuff. He's got surplus coming out of his pockets. And again, the parable doesn't say he gains this through dishonesty or through immoral practices. He's just blessed with this major, super bumper crop. And then that leads him to have an internal conversation, a little conversation with himself. He says, self, we need to talk. Okay. And that internal conversation is the goal of that is to decide what to do with all of the extra stuff that he doesn't need for now to live on. Are you with me? And then finally, at the end of that internal conversation, he just decides, I'm going to keep it all for myself. I'm not going to share it. I don't care about other people. I'm going to tear down my sufficient barns and build bigger barns. And then I'm going to take a swan dive into the ocean of self-indulgence. It's all about me. I'm going to spend it all on me. Now, if I was a Sunday school teacher in our Sunday school class, I'd tell the story just a little bit differently. Here's a guy that's got every toy imaginable, everything he could ever want, times 2 or 3, and he doesn't have any place to put it. So he puts a lot of stuff in his closet. He runs out of space there. He fills up the garage, runs out of space there, asks his mom and dad to rent a couple of storage units down the road so he can put all of his stuff down there. And he has to build bigger places to store all this stuff because it's all about me, my. And this guy just says, I'm going to spend it all on myself and I'm going to be fat and happy. All right? That's what's happening. Now, question here, because you're my large Sunday school class now. Is there anything wrong with this man's reasoning? Anything at all? There are a lot of things wrong with his reasoning. To start with, you see nothing in his personal talk with himself about God who made him and blessed him. You see nothing in this man's thought about his neighbor who might be in need. And you see nothing about his civic responsibility as a member of society. And probably worst of all, he has absolutely no clue that he is mortal and he does not control the future. You see that? This is a serious problem. He's got a bumper crop, but a bumper crop doesn't buy you extra time in this world. And indeed, he dies that night. He didn't control that. You and I are mortal. Have you ever gone outside during the wintertime and just kind of blown a puff of air and watched it? I mean, this happens like once a decade in California, but have you ever done that? You just go, and you see your breath. That's kind of cool. How long does that last? It's a mist. It's a vapor. Did you know the Bible actually says you and I are mists or vapor? In James chapter 4, verse 14, it says, why do you don't even know what will happen tomorrow, mortal man, is what he's saying. What is your life? You are a mist or a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes. You and me, we're mortal. I have presided over the funerals of children that have died in the first week of their life. I also presided over the funeral of a man that lived to be 102. But you and I, we don't get an invitation to our own funeral. We're all mortal, and we need to deal honestly with our mortality before our immortal God. Let me show you a couple of fatal mistakes this man made, so that we avoid them. Number one, he didn't see beyond himself. It was all about me in this story. God and the needs of others didn't even hit his radar screen. He had no consciousness about his vertical relationship, rightly aligning himself with God, or his horizontal relationship of rightly aligning himself with people around him. He saw himself as the only guy in the universe. It was just me, my. He never considered that God had blessed him with a huge surplus so that he could honor God by sharing it with other people that were in need immediately around him who needed it right away. I want you to look at his internal conversation, guys, and I cheated just a little bit so that you wouldn't miss the point, okay? Look at what he actually says. See if you catch the pattern, okay? What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I will say to myself, self, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. You catch any pattern here? I, my, myself, I, myself, and I, right? It's all about himself. He didn't see beyond himself. That's what greed does. Greed makes you self-centered, and you don't think about other relationships. It's a serious disease. Let me give you a second principle here. Our soul, our life, our possessions are God's property, which he can take back at any moment. And he doesn't need your permission, by the way. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, this is a distant history, it's about 3,000 years ago, but David was actually working with the people of Israel to raise the finances to build a temple for God where they could worship. And when he was doing that, he was encouraging people to give generously. And what he said in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 11 is, yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and on earth is yours. So he's first of all saying, it's not ours anyways, it's just on loan. Then a little later on in verse 16 he says, and Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for the building of a temple for your holy name, it comes from your hand and it all belongs to you. Once again he's acknowledging we're just managers or stewards and we're just channels. But God owns it all. And Jesus warns us in another place in the New Testament, in Matthew 10:28, he says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And he's speaking about having a proper fear or reverence towards God above all things. Don't put anything in front of God. Make sure God is number one. Everything else is a distant second. You got to understand that there's no wisdom in this man's thinking. There's no generosity. There's no restraint of self-indulgence. Money and material possessions. He thought more is better, more make you happy. No, more doesn't make you happy. My daughter's here this morning, one of my daughters, and you'll remember this, honey, when we were on the mission field, we had almost nothing. All our stuff was used. Well, so we never were afraid people would come and steal it from us. Because we had almost nothing, right? But now that we're here, we've got a few things in our garage, and we've accumulated a little bit, right? And so, you know, what happens is as you grow assets, you have to buy an alarm system and a safe. And then you don't sleep as well. Then you worry, with all this stuff, someone might take my stuff. My precious stuff. Lions and tigers and bears. Oh, my. It doesn't give you peace. It takes your peace away. It doesn't add life. It shortens your life. It's the exact opposite of what people think. And some people say, oh, well, the pastor, you're saying money and material possessions are evil. No, I'm not. We live in a material world. God made matter. Matter's not evil. What's wrong is our attitude about money and earthly wealth and what it can deliver and what it becomes to us and in us. Greed, covetousness, it becomes evil. Now, Abraham was super wealthy and he pleased God. There's a number of very wealthy believers in the New Testament, like Barnabas or Lydia from Thyatira, that had all kinds of assets, but they weren't attached to them. They were free and generous at living rich toward God. It has to do with our attitude towards this stuff. And to make wealth your ultimate value in life, it's not only sin towards God, it's nuts. So this man not only didn't see beyond himself, he did not see beyond this world. He thought it was all in the here and now. And by the way, that's what's happening in America. The number of people called nuns who have no religious affiliation, that are agnostic or atheist, is growing in our country. It's about 23% of our society now. And you got to understand, these folks think the whole game is in this lifetime. Nothing comes after it. Boy, are they in for a surprise. This is not everything, folks. And this guy was a fool because he did not see beyond this world. Everything he planned was based on the here and now. Think about the contrast of this story. Me versus God and others. Now versus forever. Stark contrasts in this parable. He just didn't get it. I don't know if you've been watching the news this week. There was a nasty plane crash in Russia this week. There were 71 people on board, and this plane skidded onto the runway, and it started to spark and catch on fire. And the stewards and stewardesses were very brave at helping people get off. But 43 people died about a minute and a half into it when the back of the plane exploded. And when they did an assessment of it, they discovered they could have all got off safely, except for the behavior of the people in the front of the line. You know what they did? Instead of jumping onto the little evacuation slide, they stopped to get their stuff. They reached for their handbags. They reached for their carry-ons. And even some of them died, and everybody behind them died. There was no rear exit. They all had to exit from the front. And do you get what's going on here? This is nuts. We're just grasping at what can't last and losing what lasts forever. It's nuts. This guy didn't see beyond his world. Friends, there's a kingdom coming that exceeds our wildest imaginations, and it outlasts the present kingdom. And you and I will want to be a part of this kingdom of God. So you and I have to prepare for eternity in this lifetime, and that takes faith. This is why we have to learn what it means to be rich toward God in the here and now. And by the way, some people say, they read verse 21 or whatever verse it is. It says, "You fool. This very night your life will be taken from you." The actual word there, it's suke in the Greek, and it actually means soul. This very night your soul will be taken from you. And what Jesus is saying is you are fundamentally a spiritual being having a temporary human experience, and it is your spirit that's made in the image of God that is worth more than any material, and you need to invest a lot in the development of your spirit. It's the only thing you're taken out of this world. Let me give you a third principle here. This is a little bit sobering, okay? People who never remember that there is another world coming are destined for a terrible shock when they die. A terrible shock when they die. You're in Luke chapter 12. If you took the trouble to turn to Luke chapter 16, 4 chapters away, you'd find another story of another extremely self-indulgent man who lived everything for himself. But every day they placed a humble beggar at his front gate who couldn't even walk and was full of ulcerated sores that the dogs licked. I mean, it's pretty gross. This rich man never did a thing to help this poor man who would have eaten the crumbs from that man's table. And one day they both died. And the scripture says the rich man died and immediately woke up in the torments of hell. Jesus is not joking with us here. Heaven and hell are very real, and real people go to both places. That's why we have got to figure this out. Jesus didn't say, watch out. Jesus said, watch out! This is terrible. You can't let this happen to you. Watch out. Be on your guard against all forms of greed that would take hold of your heart and ruin your life. You can't go that route. More material wealth without God is never better. This man lived without God. It's not going to make you happy or extend your life. And by the way, I don't know if you ever thought about this, but since we're not eternal on this earth, you don't own anything. You think you do. Yes, but you should see all my storage units. They're full. Why? Well, we've lined it up to have 12 trailers. Go get that stuff and attach it to the hearse for my funeral. I'm taking it with me. Well, no, you're not. God owns everything. He loans us life. He gives us breath. He loans us material assets as a test. He's going to call us to account at any moment at his pleasure. He's the one that blows the whistle. He doesn't get your permission ahead of time. Nobody receives an invitation to their own funeral. So we need to live in a regular, steady state of preparedness. We need to learn how to be rich toward God. And so that's what I want to do. Even Jesus, look what he says in another place in Matthew 16. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? And so, let me tell you this story. It's interesting. There's this very, very godly, seasoned old man. He had a lot of scars. He'd learned a lot of lessons. And he was one day talking with a very ambitious young man who was just about to, start his whole life. So the older, seasoned, godly man, he says, "Young man, what do you plan to do with this life that God has given you?" And the young guy said, "Well, I'm going to learn a trade. I'm going to get a career, get my education, and just get launched into a career." The old man said, "And then?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to set myself up in business. I'm going to be my own boss. And then, well, that's when I'm going to make a ton of money, lots of money. And then, well, I suppose eventually I'll grow older and I'll retire and I'll live off all of my money. And then, well, if you're going to be pushy, I guess eventually, like everyone else, I die. And then, this man made a fatal assumption that he was in control of his future. He was not. He was not. More material wealth without God, instead of being better, is worse for you. It takes you further into greed. You don't see beyond yourself. You don't see beyond this world. It gets you in trouble. And so I want to talk to you about, look at this verdict God gives. It's a strong verdict. He says, "You fool." Do you realize in the scriptures, the Bible, it tells us we are not allowed to use that expression in talking about other people, and yet God uses it here. "You fool, this very night, your life," remember, your soul, "will be required of you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself?" Fool is a strong word. And by the way, it doesn't mean that he didn't have knowledge. It doesn't mean that he had a low IQ. He could have won Jeopardy 15 days in a row. Because there's a lot of people that are smart with high IQs that are not wise. Wisdom is connecting the dots of knowledge, and seeing they point back to God, and realizing everything you do needs to be filtered through God, pointed towards God, because you will see God one day, and he will establish his kingdom on earth, and we want to be a part of it. That's wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs says, Proverbs 1:7. If you don't factor God into everything you do, God says you're a fool. The fool says in his heart there is no God. That's what this guy does. Doesn't mean he had a low IQ. It meant that he was morally not wise. There was no wisdom in his thinking, and it sunk his ship. Even the Romans, who were greedy people, they said that riches is like salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. So let me just talk to you a little bit about turning the tide on this one and learning how to live rich toward God. Verse 21, it's the application of this parable. "This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." And what I want to do is I want to pastor you in these minutes, these last few minutes we have together. And I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I'm going to ask you not to blow me off. I'll tell you why. Because when I was a younger man and preachers got up to speak about money and wealth, it was one of those times I turned off and figured I knew better than them. And the newsflash was, I did not. And so I made some mistakes in this area. And I don't want you to make mistakes like that. So let me talk to you about what the Bible says about what it means to live rich toward God. All right? First of all, let me just say that our approach toward money and material wealth is a faith test. Remember, it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. He loans it temporarily to us. We borrow it, right? And one day we will have to give an account for that. It's interesting that passage that I quoted from David about the construction, the giving for the temple and the building of the temple. The very next verse, David says, "I know, my God, that you test the heart and you are pleased with integrity. And the context is, when it comes to money matters and material possessions, God, I know they're a test from you. God, help our people pass that test. Help us get a good grade on that test. Because everything that flows through our lives actually belongs to God, and we're simply managers of that stuff. And that's why God says, don't pile up resources on earth for yourself and spend it on yourself, because that's crazy. And some people would say, well, then it must be a sin to have money or save money. No. The Bible has a nice counterbalance here. The Bible never says it's a sin to save money or to make some intelligent investments, wise investments, or even to prepare for retirement. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11 says, whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. So I want you to understand that God is not opposed to us owning a house, owning a car, buying clothes and food, taking care of our kids. God knows about smut bills. All right, He gets it. It's the exaggeration of spending everything that comes into our life on ourselves, because we put money and material wealth in front of God, because more is better and more makes us happy. We believe it, and it's not true. It's not true. See, the point is perspective. Now, let's imagine we're playing a board game here, okay? Do you guys like to play games? Okay, first of all, the average lifespan is about 80 years. Did you guys know that? This is the younger side of the crowd, so you're not worried too much, right? 80 years, right? And how long does eternity last? We were a little slow on that one, but it's okay. It's forever. So we're playing a board game called 80 Years and Forever, okay? I'm going to make a lot of money, and then I'm going to break all the rules of this sermon, okay? Here we go. Here's the game. So 80 years and forever. So if you got forever over here, and it's ... right? It's just then over on so like 99.9% of the board says forever, and then there's this little teeny tiny corner that says now. It's called 80 years, all right? Do you get it? Because 80 years with eternity is just a little, that's it. It's just a little whatever. It's just tiny, okay? So let's imagine you get $1,000. Oh, no, let's make it bigger. Let's imagine you get $100,000, and it's all play money, so don't freak out, all right? And you're playing the board game, and it's your turn, and you're supposed to decide how to allocate $100,000 and to set it on the board the way you would really like to invest it, okay? So you're sitting there, oh, put all 100,000 on now. What? You see what I'm saying? Wouldn't it at least make sense, even if you've got electricity bills and school and all that stuff, that you'd put at least half on forever? Do you understand what I'm saying? God's saying live rich towards God. We got to figure this one out. This is more than a board game. Jesus says in Matthew 6, do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Store up for yourselves rather treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So the second thing I want to say about living rich towards God is to keep God in your now calculations. And that little board game called 80 Years and Forever, make sure you're remembering God in the 80-year area. And you could say, well, God doesn't need my money. That is true. God isn't going to the convenience store saying, hey, can I borrow $1? I want a Coke. No. So why do we need to give God anything? And what in the world does it mean to live rich towards God? Thanks for asking. You see, you live rich towards God when you make what matters most to Him matter most to you. And it means that we need to proactively look for kingdom initiatives and invest in those kingdoms like a portfolio. And I say this without apology. I would say it at any church, even if I wasn't a pastor. The New Testament makes it clear that the local church is to be your priority in the area of giving. And you know why? Because churches are kingdom outposts in this world. Jesus said, I will build my... Okay, let's try that again. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Okay, so if the church is the kingdom outpost, that means this is the place where people gather and where you can worship God together. It's the place where, and it's not the location, it's the group, right? This is where we meet with God. This is where we can discover God. This is where we can grow in God. This is where we can mature. It's a point of reference. It's a kingdom outpost on earth. So I say without apology, our financial priority in living rich towards God needs to be the local church. I don't think it ends there, though. I think that if you're going to live rich towards God, you need to think about supporting missionaries around the world that are taking the gospel to other places. I think you ought to also consider investing in neighborhood block parties. Remember, we talked about the art of neighboring, getting to know your neighbors and loving your neighbors yourself. I think that's a pretty good investment, if you ask me. I think you ought to consider sponsoring a kid through Compassion International to give them Jesus and to break the cycle of poverty. I think you ought to consider helping people that are temporarily living through a setback financially. Somebody lost a job or they're having a problem with health. Or maybe you should just be giving food and resources to the local homeless who don't, whether it's their fault or it's not their fault, they go to bed hungry. It's interesting that in Proverbs chapter 19, it says this. It says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord. Wouldn't you like to be guilty of lending money to God? Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. I encourage you to look for spiritual kingdom initiatives where you can use temporary resources to create eternal impact. That is wisdom in my mind. Spending something in that 80 years area that will last forever. Here's the next piece of this advice. Honor God by creating financial margin. Now the scriptures just point blank in Proverbs chapter 3 verse 9 say this: honor the Lord with your wealth. It's just straight up. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of your crops. So Israel was to give the first portion of their wealth. Their crops were their money. Their herds were their money. So they were supposed to give the first part to God. That way they didn't get stuck with leftovers and give God pocket change. So honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops, and then your barns will be filled to overflowing and your vats will brim over with new wine. Isn't it interesting? This parable is about barns. It's just interesting how all these themes link up. What does it mean to honor God by creating financial margin? Jesus really blasts greed in this parable because greed demands to be fed like a dragon, and greed is always hungry. It destroys you in slow motion, and it badly distorts your perspective on what really matters. The world that we live in around us is screaming at us all the time that you deserve the best in everything, and you deserve it now. And so people, good people, Christian people, fall into the trap of buying things they cannot afford and just putting it on plastic, put it on credit cards, figure out how to pay for it later, borrow, go into debt, get overextended financially, and become financial slaves. Lose your freedom, lose your peace. Now I know I'm stepping on some toes, and I'm doing it right at the end of the service so I can run before you shoot me. But I know in my experience that a group this big, there's people that have made some financial mistakes, and you're in trouble right now. I just know it. And I'm not here to beat you up. I'm actually here to lift you up and give you a little bit of hope. Because if that's where you find yourself, I want to tell you two things. One thing that's a little hard to hear, and the other that's a resource that could help you get out. The first thing I want to tell you is, if you are living in debt, you can't even obey the scriptures of Luke chapter 12 to live rich towards God. You have no margin to do it. If you make 100 and you live on 90, you have a 10 margin that you can use to be rich toward God. But if you make 100 and you spend 107, you ain't got no margin. You cannot be rich toward God. You have to live a disobedient life before the Lord in the area of money. That's not a good place to be. So let me just tell you that we're about to launch, this is our second year of doing it. It's called Creekside U, or Creekside University. During the summer when our life groups are taking a break, we offer courses here at our church where people meet once a week. It's usually Tuesday nights, and we're starting it again on the 18th of June. And we're offering 4 classes, and we've been putting that in your program so you can see that. One of them has to do with marriage or parenting. One of them has to do with Jesus. But there's one that's called FPU, or Financial Peace University by Dave Ramsey. And we've been doing this as a church for years. And I just want you to know, I don't know of anything out there that is better for helping people get out of financial slavery than FPU. I think it's the best resource. And by the way, let me just say this too. Whether you ever give a penny to this church or not, you should take this class. Because this class will help you get your lips above water and help you live free. Because Jesus wants you to be free. Emotionally free, spiritually free, financially free. So that you can breathe. And by the way, it's the only way you could potentially honor God with your wealth, by living with a margin. You have to create it. And I know historically, this church has probably paid quite a bit more than $1 million down in debt of people that have gone through this course and have gotten free. So this is, boy, if you hear me right now and you're in financial trouble, or you're just curious and you want to learn how to better honor God with your wealth, sign up for this class. There's already people signing up for this class. It starts on June 18th. So I'm done with my PR on that one. Let me just say one last thing because I'm hungry and I got to go. I can't believe it's Mother's Day and my wife is home cooking. But she said it's the only way she could get everything that she wanted on the table. So okay, great. Living rich toward God is a learned lifestyle. We are sinners. We are fallen. So you know what comes natural to us? Living for ourselves and living for now. What comes natural to us is the lifestyle of the rich fool in this parable. If you're going to break that nasty cycle, you've got to learn new rhythms. You've got to want to learn them, and then you've got to learn them. And it's not easy, but it's great when you learn it. Living rich towards God means that you got to say no to the dragon of more. My wife and I recently went on a vacation up to Oregon. We stopped at an antique store, okay? Found a really cool table. And I said, isn't that a cool table? And my wife, she was so wise. She said, honey, yes it is, but we don't need it. Our house is full of furniture. We're fine. We don't need anything else more in our house. Isn't that, can you ever get to that place where you just say, we don't need anything more in this home? So let's just say no to ourselves more often so we can say yes more often to God. That's a great place to be, folks. How many square feet do you need in your home? How many bedrooms do you need in your home? We got to learn how to say no to ourselves more often so we could say yes to God more often. We also need to look at investment with eternal eyes. That takes time, but thinking in terms of the fact that we will live forever, and we should send some stuff on ahead. Somebody in this church gave me a definition that made a lot of sense, so let me just wrap it up in the simple definition with a final statement. That living rich towards God, it means using a generous portion of our resources now, while we're still alive, to advance God's kingdom purposes on earth, rather than using everything God loans us in this lifetime for ourselves or to try to make our life more cushy or comfortable. And it takes faith, or you'd never do that. And so here, I've never heard a better statement on stewardship or management than this simple line. In this area of our life, what God is seeking for us is that we would so order our lives that Jesus is free to spend them. We would so live in obedience and alignment with Jesus Christ, with margin, that Jesus could direct us by His Spirit so that we are His channels of mercy and grace in this world until we move into the next world. That's all I got to say about that today. Father, this morning as our ushers are coming, I just want to thank you, God, that you give us tests, but not tests to try to bring us down, but tests to build us up. And one of those bigger tests in this lifetime has to do with money and material wealth. And I want to pray that everybody in my hearing passes that test. And God, I know this is a long game thing, but I want to pray that you teach us what it means to live rich towards you. And we thank you, Jesus, that you completely emptied yourself and became poor so that we could become rich. So as we give now, as we sing, praise you, look to you, God, would you remind us that we could never outgive you, and we just want to thank you for being such a generous God, and ask that you help us enter into your generous heart, but to do so with the eyes of eternity. God, we're just pleading with you, and I'm just multiplying words, but we're asking that you help us by faith to learn how to live rich towards you, to bring you honor and to add to people's lives around us. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.